Okay, and we're on with Miles Masterson. This is Stephen K. Peeples here, and I'm in sunny Southern California, and Miles is across the interwebs many miles away in sunny South Africa. Welcome, Miles.
Thanks, Stephen. Good to be here.
Miles is a surfer, journalist, author, an all-around storyteller and communicator. He's also the author of the definitive 2025 biography of John Whitmore. Now, he's the water sports legend who put South African surfing and catamaran competition on the international map starting in the 1960s and 70s. The book is titled The Oim, the biography of South African water sports pioneer John Whitmore. Miles also appears in Richard Yelland's award-winning 2021 documentary Birth of the Endless Summer, which is the backstory to Bruce Brown's 1964 epic surf travelogue, The Endless Summer. And Miles' book about John Whitmore is essentially the backstory behind the backstory. So Miles, tell us what the book means, what the title means, and how you pronounce it.
So it's the worm.
The worm.
The worm.
Oim. Okay.
Worm. Worm.
Okay, like O-E-M.
Yeah, more or less. It's
Phonetic.
It's Afrikaans, which is obviously derived from Dutch, and it means uncle. And there's a family connection where he sort of got the nickname from family members, and it sort of stuck. And he became he wasn't just an uncle; he was the uncle. So he's the godfather of South African surfing, pretty much.
Yeah. Well, now, how did you learn about John Whitmore, and what compelled you to write his story?
So I grew up on what's called the Atlantic Seaboard in Cape Town. So it's a series of just a couple of surf spots, but it's a really beautiful landscape. And I actually went to high school in Camps Bay, which is the town that John lived in, grew up in, and there's a surf spot there called Glen Beach, which for many years was a sort of hotbed of Cape Town surfing talent. And I went to school. The school's right up on the hill that actually overlooks the surf break. And
that's good. So you could decide whether or not to go to school or go surfing.
I mean, every year in the beginning of the year when they have all the new classes in the school, and you graduated up a level and you have to go and find your new classroom. All the classrooms that face the ocean, there's a stampede of the surfers elbowing everyone else out the way to get to the window seat, so they could see the surf. And apparently the principal of the school had a pair of binoculars, and he could see the surf from his office and see who's bunking.
Yes,
surfing on the surf was good.
Yeah, see who's skipping school for surf.
Yeah, so it was a real sort of surf orientated school, and John obviously was the legend of legends. I grew up surfing. I'm from a place a little bit further down the coast. I grew up in a place called Hart Bay. Grew up surfing at a place called Llandudno, which is pretty good wedging right-hander. And so and it's about 5 or 6 kilometers of coast. It's very reminiscent of Laguna, San Clemente area. It looks quite similar, which has a lot of bearing on the story as well.
Yes.
So John was just sort of this, obviously when I started surfing in what we call provincial state contests, John had already moved on to the Hobie Cats and he wasn't really involved in surfing. But obviously, the guys that I looked up to surfing at Glen Beach and Llandudno was in particular Johnny Parman, who's a very well-known South African surfer, and his brother Donald, and a bunch of other guys as well. But mainly, Johnny was the king of the coast at that time, and obviously John's his uncle, and that's where the name came from. And we heard all the stories about John, all his exploits over the years and all the surf spots that he discovered. I mean, I went to Yelland's Bay when I was 12 years old in 1984. And we knew that the Oim had discovered all these spots that we surf regularly,
right?
And many other stories as well. around the endless summer and, how that all came to be. And then just other legends about, just stories about parties, legendary parties and exploits of the old school surfers in the 50s and 60s. I grew up with hearing all these stories passed down through the generations. And then the Surface Journal in 2008 commissioned me to do a story on John. And the angle there was that he was the missing member or the long lost member of the Dana Point Mafia.
Right.
Because he was so tight with Bruce and Hobie and all those guys.
Grubby Clark.
Yeah, all of them. And the big joke was that he was the long lost missing sort of member of the gang. That was the angle of the story. And then while I was compiling the story, I found out from Cyan, which is John's youngest daughter, who was at high school. She was many years ahead of me, but I knew her quite well. It was a really small community, that very famous South African editor and author by the name of Tony Hurd, who grew up in Buckhoven, who was a neighbor of John's, had considered doing a biography on John many years before. And, he's a very well-known journalist in sort of mainstream, serious news. He was the editor of a local newspaper, and he was very anti-apartheid. He was, there's a picture of him with Nelson Mandela. He's like very famous. Passed away a few years ago. And I thought to myself, well, if the journalist or the caliber of Tony Hort thinks there's a book there, then maybe there's something, there's something to this. So even when I was researching the Surface Journal article, I started to think, okay, maybe this is something that I could tackle. I was sort of uniquely positioned to do that because I'm a surfer. I grew up in the area. I know everybody, a lot of the people that were key people that I needed to interview. And the other motivating factor for me was that, okay, this is a book that I wanted to read,
Yeah.
That was probably the primary motivator, but also the fact that there'd never been a book, well, there hasn't been a book until my book, documenting South African surfing history, especially in that early era, at all. There's been a few mentions in a few, Surfline did a book a few years ago about Jeffreys Bay, and then there's been a couple of other books where there's been a paragraph or, or two or three about South African surfing history and John's contribution to it. But there's never been a book like this written ever in South Africa. This is the first proper book documenting South African surfing history that's ever been published. And so that was a big motivating factor for me as well to just, that's kind of my contribution and giving back to the culture that's given me so much as a surfer. And then I got stuck in. Yeah.
Well, it would be very hard to separate John's story from the history of South African surfing because he was such a kingpin and such a driver in making everything happen there.
No, absolutely. I mean, he was the first, he created the first surfboard brand, Whitmore Surfboards.
Right.
He was the first full-time shaper. He had a small shop in his factory after he met Dick Metz and made that California connection, which we'll get to later. He started importing Californian wax and stickers and T-shirts and started selling them in his shop. So really, that was the first surf shop in South Africa. And then he went on to obviously found Western Province Surfing, which is the province where I live. And then he was very instrumental in setting up the state bodies for all the other provinces as well.
Right.
And then through that process, once those were all set up, then he set up the national body, which was called the South African Surf Riders Association in 1965.
SASA.
Yeah, and then he very fortuitously, as a skin diver, he pioneered skin diving in Cape Town as well, which I didn't even know, before I started researching the book. Him and two or three other guys were the first skin divers as spear fishermen in Cape Town. The guys are doing it on the east coast of South Africa, where the water's a lot warmer. But nobody had done it in Cape Town until these guys started, and John was one of the first guys to do that. But anyway, he became friendly with this guy, Frank Waring, who was a politician.
Yes.
And Frank Waring ended up very high in the South African apartheid government. In fact, he was the second most powerful man in the country. And it's quite strange because he was an English speaker. He wasn't Afrikaans. He was a Springbok rugby player though. And John and him they had struck up a friendship while they were skin diving in the 50s in Cape Town. And through that connection, Frank Waring became the Minister of Sport. And John was able to get the Springbok colours, the national colours for surfers in 1965, which was, in 66, which was a massive thing because that was, the Springbok rugby. There were about 10 other sports that had Springbok designation, golf, tennis, rugby, all the mainstream sports. And surfing was such a young sport, and John managed to get this Springbok designation for the sport and really elevated it to, on a national level to this really sort of high-profile pastime, and got a lot of funding, which enabled the teams to go and travel to the ISF World Contest. So he was really instrumental in laying that really solid foundation for South African surfing that, quickly made it a powerhouse in the sport ever since.
Well, he kind of started out organizing amateur competitions, and
it was all amateur back then.
Yes, and later on there was a conflict between the amateur and the pro, but that's another story. I wanted to get to the Endless Summer connection.
Yes,
it's a good chunk of your story, and John's story, is how he came to be a co-star of the Endless Summer. In 1963, California filmmaker Bruce Brown followed surfers Robert August and Mike Hinson around the world in search of perfect waves, and they found them in South Africa at a place called Cape St. Francis. Miles' book details how Brown first heard about those perfect waves from Dick Metz, a vagabond friend of his and Hobie Alters and Grubby Clark's, who grew up surfing in Laguna Beach, California, and knew what was happening on the whole California surf scene. The book also recounts how Dick was traveling in Africa and learned about Cape St. Francis from none other than John Whitmore. So, Miles, please tell us a story that's really funny, the story of their very first encounter in early January 1960 on the beach at Boat Bay.
Yeah, so Dick had been traveling around the world. And, the whole story is, been told many, many times, how he was hitchhiking through Africa and wanted to see Victoria Falls. And he got a lift with this guy that was traveling to Cape Town, and he arrived at Victoria Falls in the middle of the night. And he decided instead to go and have a look at Cape Town because he didn't want to get out of the vehicle.
And it was cold.
Yeah, and it was, it was the middle of the night, and it was just black, and he was like, you could see one of the two little fires, and he decided, let me go see Cape Town. I'll see Vic Falls on the way back. So totally just a snap decision that he made. Didn't want to get out of the comfortable car that he was in, and ended up on the coast in South Africa, on the beach in Cape Town, and just sauntered down to the beach and saw this guy surfing. And John fell off his board, a very rudimentary polystyrene board, and it washed in, and Dick picked it up and started looking at it, and then John got out of the water, and Dick by then had been traveling for years and been through Africa, and he really looked like a hobo, and John was like, who the hell is this guy? And then he said, is this your surfboard? And John said, yes. He says, well, you guys need some advice because this is a piece of crap. And John was a bit indignant, and then they both. And the real thing I think that pushed John over the edge is John had discovered surfing in a diving magazine, American diving magazine called Skin Diver.
Right.
He'd seen a Janssen ad on the back of George Downing and a couple of other guys surfing at Makaha, and that was the first time he ever saw a picture of surfing. And obviously one of them was George Downing, and then Dick mentioned him. Oh, no, George Downing, and he was like, John was like, you've got to come home with me. So he took him home to his home in Buckhoven, a beachside bungalow, in a little cove called Buckhoven, just in Camps Bay, a couple of k's down the coast. And they struck up a friendship. And Dick stayed in Cape Town for a while, and then eventually Dick had this mission. He wanted to go to the Olympics in Athens in 1960. So he had a schedule. He had to leave, and John said to him, well, and he wanted to go up the East Coast and to Durban and then Johannesburg and then go back to Africa, back up to Europe. And John said to him, well, you must go to St. Francis because there's some surf there and there's a place you can stay. And John was an explorer of South Africa. He discovered so many surf spots. I mean, he was the first surfer to lay eyes on Jeffreys Bay.
Jeffreys Bay.
Yeah, he saw through his binoculars from the highway and deemed it too fast. He was a goofy footer, and obviously J-Bay's all right. And he'd been surfing at this other spot called Hewlett's at St. Francis, which is Bruce's Beauties breaks into Hewlett's, the right, and then there's a little reef just on the end of Bruce's that breaks left and right, but it's quite a nice bowly left, and that's where John used to go and stay and surf. He said to Dick, well, you can go and stay with Leighton Hewlett. He's got some bungalows there, some rondavels, as you call them, the traditional round African huts. And then Dick went there and saw this amazing place. I mean, St. Francis, incredible, and saw the waves breaking in Hewlett's. Dick didn't surf there; he didn't have a board with him. He was just body surfing. And then when he went back to California, he said to Bruce, and Bruce was pondering his next movie. He just finished Waterlogged, and he was like, okay, what do I do now? And Mike Henson said to me that by then there were quite a lot of surf filmmakers in California, and the whole genre was coming a little bit stale. It was the same guys at the same spots, and Bruce was really trying to break out of that creatively. And he mentioned to Dick, I've got this idea of traveling somewhere. And Dick said, you've got to go to Cape Town, you've got to hook up with John, and you've got to go to St. Francis or go up the East Coast of South Africa. And so that sort of, as Dana Brown says in the Birth at the End of Summer, the domino. This was the dominoes falling, where John discovering this great place to surf at Hewlett's Reef ultimately meant that Bruce and Robert and Mike ended up there. And the funny thing is that so John used to travel quite a lot in the winter. Up the east coast of South Africa, because that's when the ground swells come and J-Bay and all the other point breaks on the east coast work. But Bruce is a bit different. Bruce is really tucked inside the bay, and it actually only works in the east swell or a very, very big south swell, which generally come in the summertime. And that's when Bruce and Robert and Mike happened to be traveling, and they would just be confronted by onshore slop the whole way up the coast. They had one little session that's in the movie at the Wilderness. So, the expectations are pretty low and they were getting pretty frustrated. And then obviously they got to St. Francis and they woke up the next morning and old Mark Henson went down to smoke a little marijuana pipe and saw these waves rolling in, and try to wake the other guys up. They wouldn't wake up. And it's, for me also, that part of the story, I did some research about it. Apparently some French author wrote a book about it, which is been sort of considered to be, one of the more definitive, objective documents of that whole journey. Obviously, you've got Mike's book, the Transcendent, Mike Hinson's book.
Yes, Mike.
I can't remember the name right now, but that book. But that's very much from Mike's perspective, and
Adventures of a Surf Rebel, something like that.
The one, and it's only a small part of his whole life. So for me, that was actually part of the book that I enjoyed writing the most as well, because it's very much told from a South African point of view and more objective in terms of, okay, this is actually what really happened. Forget all the hype and all the stories that other people have told. This is actually what happened. John discovered that area. He didn't obviously discover Bruce's because he never saw it break, which is so ironic. But the fact that those guys, the sheer happenstance, so that they happened to just arrive there on the morning, had been blown very strong onshore, and that's generally one of the there's three scenarios where you get waves at Bruce's. A very, very big south swell, which is quite rare. Most of the swells are southwest or west. Or a cyclone far off Durban, which generates a big ground swell that comes down the east coast of South Africa, or you get a wind swell, which is generally when Bruce's breaks the most. And it doesn't break that often. It breaks 10 times a year if you're lucky. I mean, these South African surfers been surfing in South Africa their entire lives, and they've never surfed it. They've never been in that area when there's been waves. I'm fortunate I've surfed it 3 times. in my whole life of surfing and going up the East Coast. So, it's very rare. And they got there that morning. And also the westerly wind, the offshore, that time of year is quite rare as well. You don't get many westerlies in summer. And so that combination of conditions, the low tide, you need a low tide of Bruce's for the waves to break on the sand. High tide, even back then, there were waves, but it wasn't, as good as it gets. And I mean, for them to get that quality Bruce's, I mean, it's just like absolutely preordained, as John called it. and that just triggered that segment, Bruce, the end of summer was in the shadow of what it was, and the impact that it had without that finding that perfect wave, just had so much influence globally on surfing and surf travel, but also in South Africa as a surfing destination. People started flocking there. The economy of St. Francis itself, and that whole area, obviously J-Bay was surfed very, very shortly after that. And then you've got Seal Point down the road, and you've got a whole lot of little secret spots and beach breaks. That place is riddled with surf.
Yeah.
It's like, now it's a surfing mecca. And so it had so much influence in so many ways that that whole chain of events that led to that sequence in the movie. So it's really amazing. And, a lot of people contributed, in my opinion, and perhaps I'm biased, it all goes back to John and his insatiable curiosity to find surf spots. Because that's not the only surf spot. He must have discovered, I would say, probably 30 or 40 of Elands Bay, and then there's the whole of the East Coast of South Africa is just riddled with right-hand point breaks. And he was the first to surf most of them.
Right.
So,
right.
Our whole surfing culture in South Africa owes a lot to the worm.
Well, I want to go back to the beach where John and Dick met, and Dick was commenting about. He said that's the ugliest surfboard I've ever seen. Talking about John's surfboard, and you, as you said, John made it by hand, basically just by looking at a photograph or an ad. It was actually an illustration, right, of a surfboard. So from that he crafted a surfboard, but it was out of plywood and canvas. It was 12 feet long. This is 1954 now. And, the state of South African surfing at that point in 54 was pretty nascent. He was among a handful of surfers who were out there surfing on surfboards that he manufactured. Because after he made his own, there were other people who said, "Hey, that's cool. I want to do that. Can you make me one?" And he went into the business, and that was the launch of Whitmore surfboards. But a Whitmore surfboard was kind of based on a hand-fashioned surfboard, as opposed to something that was crafted with fiberglass and foam and proper templates for surfing, as was going on in Southern California. And this is how Dick connected John and the nascent, burgeoning South African surf industry with the Southern California surf industry for mutual benefit, I should say. But tell me a little bit about the process of him founding his own surfboard company and the early demand among South African surfers for Whitmore surfboards.
So actually, in the all the way from the 90s, there's a very famous Australian surfer called Snowy McAllister who actually came to Durban in 1928 and did a surfing demonstration.
Yes.
And stand-up surfing had actually been quite reasonably well established in Durban from then onwards. Obviously, the war years, but after World War II, because of the life-saving connection. The life-saving was very big in Durban, and there was a very strong link between Australia and South Africa through the lifesavers. And so a lot of the lifesavers in Australia and America and Hawaii and that, they surf.
Right.
And so, but they were all surfing on, what they call the kook boxes, the wooden squares, the terrible old things.
The big
And-
Tom Dick thing.
Yeah, and so there was quite a well-established surf scene in Durban, and then an offshoot of that was in a city called East London, which is about halfway between Durban and Cape Town. But then beyond East London, there were no surfers. And John, when he saw this advert, the Janssen ad in this diving magazine, he wrote to friends in the US, and he actually got some instructionals from Popular Mechanics on how to build a Tom Blake hollowboard. And so he tried that, but he didn't know what he was doing. He didn't have any sort of knowledge passed down to him. He was just going into like completely like unknown territory. So a lot of trial and error. He made some kook boxes. He made some hollowboards. And then he got an instructional probably around 1950, 54, 55, when he started making boards on how to make a polystyrene board.
Yeah.
And using epoxy. But there was no epoxy in South Africa. So John had to, if you use polyurethane resin on fiberglass, it just eats it. I mean, on polystyrene, it just eats it.
Yeah.
So he had to come up with this thing. He actually used butter muslin cloth and house paint, PVC paint.
Yeah.
Painted it on, and then put the matting, the polyurethane matting over that. And this was one of these boards that he was riding when he met Dick. Was this really rude, because you couldn't. He had big, really big. They called it Sagex in South Africa, the polystyrene that they had. Really big cells, so you couldn't, it was impossible.
Hard to shape. Hard to shape.
It was just a real like a lump of. And so, when Dick, but fortuitously, just around the time that Dick, arrived, epoxy became available in South Africa, and he was able to start making epoxy boards. And Dick showed him how to do that. And so the board, that he was making prior to Dick's arrival, and then Dick spent probably, I think, about a month or a month and a half in Cape Town, and a lot of time helping John improve his surfboards. And by the time he left, the shapes that John was creating were much more. They looked a lot more like the surfboards that we used to,
Yeah.
But they're still made out of polystyrene. And then one of the developments that occurred at that period was that he was able to source a denser cell polystyrene that he could actually shape using a rasp mainly. And so his shapes became more refined. And he just big game changer was a South African surfer that Dick met in Durban called Harry Bowl. Traveled to California. He was the first South African to travel to California. And he went and he brought back a Olay board, which was a polyurethane Hobie blank, essentially a Hobie shape, because I believe that that Bob Olsen, Olay surfboards, he worked for Hobie. And so this was a Hobie design, pretty much. And he brought it back to Cape Town in 1962. And John saw this and got his calipers out and took all the measurements. And then not too long after that, Dick sent him the first consignment of Clark foam and proper surfboard resin and proper surfboard fiberglass. And then he was able to construct the first. Then the other thing that happened was that Bruce and Mike and Robert came to Cape Town in November 1963, and they had Hobie boards, so John was able to see these boards and take measurements. And so after 63 into 64, his precision and the boards that he made were way better than anything he'd done before. So it was and at the same time, the connection between Australia through another guy called Max Wetland.
Yes.
The book. Whenever I do an interview, and whenever obviously in the book, I'm at pains to say that Max made as much of a contribution to South African surfing as John did.
Yes.
And John was connected with the guys in Sydney. Max. And so the same thing started to happen quite quickly in Durban as well. And there's sort of this rivalry started to develop between the two, with Durban and Cape Town, which endures to this day, both in surfboard manufacture and in competitive surfing.
But it's very important because it really drove the development in a way that wouldn't have otherwise without
Yeah,
that.
and when the competition started, then all the top surfers were either on a Whitmore or wetland, and they were jostling for dominance of the South African surfing team. So this real healthy competitive spirit started to develop and really push the guys to new heights. So yeah, it was really instrumental. And then the other big game changer was John started blowing Clark Bones blanks a little bit later in the late 60s, 67 he started. And because demand with the success of the endless summer, explosion of surfing in South Africa, that he couldn't supply with the Clark blanks that he was importing. He couldn't supply enough of them to the shapers. Even Western used Clark blanks that he bought from John,
Right.
because people wanted Clark Bones. So John started blowing it in his factory in Cape Town. Started in 1967, but really got it right in 68. And
well, he connected with Grubby Clark to do that, right?
Yeah.
So he got the formula from Grubby and then developed the formula and refined it so that it was as good as Clark Clark foam or better.
And that was one of John's special talents. He was really sort of kind of like a mad scientist,
well, he
got it right and
reversed engineered a surfboard. I mean, that's pretty remarkable.
And by the time he traveled to the States for the first time in 1966 to San Diego for the World ISF World Contest, he was already famous. Everybody knew him from the end of summer. I mean, he's got like 10 or 12 minutes of screen time in the movie. Or South Africa does, but John,
South Africa gets like 24 minutes.
Yeah, and half of that is, John and Cape Town and, everything. So he was already well known and instantly just became friends with Bruce and Hobie and Grubby and obviously Dick he already knew. And a whole, host of other guys as well, Phil Edwards and Tom Morey, that whole Dana Point, San Clemente, mafia. He was one of them pretty much. He was a peer of theirs. And,
so in South Africa, John was after he figured out how to make surfboards and found all the surf spots and helped develop a kind of a surf community in South Africa. He was instrumental in developing competitions, both regionally and then later on internationally. But starting off with amateur competitions, didn't get into the pro stuff until later. But John was the guy who put South African surfing competition on the international map. And can you kind of, if I know it's a long story, but if you could tell us how that developed?
Yeah, well, it fascinated me about John, while I was writing the book. Sorry, did you want to finish?
How he got started with developing the contests locally, and then his desire to take it internationally so that South Africa would be included on the international surfing circuit, along with Australia, Hawaii, and Southern California.
Yeah, John's motivation to do that was one thing that really interested me, and it was he came at it from two angles. John was a fantastic marketer and promoter. Excuse me, and he knew that if the competitions grew and it got a lot of media and publicity in the newspapers, and that the sport would grow, and then he would sell more surfboards. So that was one side of it. But the other side of it as well, he was like fiercely patriotic and had this real belief from early on. I mean, he's quoted in a newspaper, writing a magazine article in 1962, I think it was, saying we need to put South Africa right there at the top. And this is before he even knew really about surfing competitions. They used to import Surfer magazine, and there was surf contest reports in there, but they didn't know they didn't really know what to do or how to do it or whatever. But he just had this ambition to elevate South African surfing. He felt it belonged up there with the established nations.
Right.
That was something that he was, probably in that era through the 60s. Obviously, he had his business. He was making surfboards. He was making blanks. But that really drove him. That was his primary driver, was to obviously get a world champion, South African surfer. That was something they really wanted to achieve, and for the teams to do well at the ISF World Contest. Then what happened was that Max Wetland was chosen by John, Harry Bold, and another guy who was equally influential in foundation of South African surfing called Baron Stander. The three of them picked Max to go to the first ISF World Contest in Sydney. And Max came back to the rule book that Eduardo Adrino had put together.
Right. How to put on a surf competition.
Pretty much, all the rules and regulations and criteria. And then Harry photocopied it and mailed it down to John. And then John formed Western Province Surfing Association, which was South Africa's first provincial surfing body. The guys in Durban had formed a provincial surfing body before that, but then it folded, it petered away. And then they only formed the replacements for that after Western Province Surfing Association. The Durban guys had the first surf contest after Max got back. And then John had the first provincial surf contest, interstate surf contest in 1964 in Cape Town, which was a massive success.
Right.
Thousands of people came to watch it. I mean, the guys always said to me, remember in those days, there was no television, there was nothing to do. So if there was something going on, everybody would get in their cars and drive down to Long Beach and go and spend the day on the beach watching these weird guys riding waves in their boards. And the novelty of surfing got so much publicity in South Africa during that era because it was just such a unique thing. And beach culture was starting to really take root. And that's why I say in the book, it wasn't just the founder of surfing in South Africa, it was the founder of beach culture.
Yeah.
Going to the beach, whether you're surfing or you're supping or you're swimming or whatever you're doing, this beach lifestyle, that we all love, really brought that aloha and the California way of approaching life to South Africa, and had a massive influence there. But yeah, the surfing competitions was something that really drove him. He had a massive ambition for the guys to succeed, and eventually they did.
But it was not an easy thing. I mean, there were 3 occasions where apartheid factored into South Africa being chosen for the site of competitions and then kiboshed because of apartheid.
Yep.
Please tell us how about that and how frustrated John was about that.
Yeah, it was a tough topic for me to tackle in the book. I really wrestled over it for actually a few years, how I would incorporate that into the narrative. Because John was, obviously he was half Afrikaans. His mother was Afrikaans, and he, was very much from the old school. And in many ways, he was a diehard amateur. For example, just abhorred, like the concept of pro surfing was just something that he really rejected. He wasn't interested in that at all. Like many of his generation,
He was a purist.
Yeah, totally. And then obviously, he was sort of embedded with the apartheid regime in terms of getting funding from the government and, the racial policies that they had to follow. Although John himself actually encouraged non-white surfers of color in South Africa at the time. And there's a great story there, which I'll maybe we'll circle back to. But one of the guys that he encouraged eventually became the head of Surfing South Africa, which replaced the South African Surf Riders Association after 1994. So there's quite a nice, loop there.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was really challenging for any sporting body. When they banned South Africa from the Olympics in '64, then again in '68, and by '70, it had become virtually impossible to, surfing, even though it had developed quite a high profile in South Africa, was still, sort of under the radar. And the ISF committee, headed by Eduardo Arena, and Hobie was on the board, and Bruce and all those guys that were very involved in running the ISF. They were also, quite happy to welcome the South Africans and sort of keep it on a sporting level. The old adage, don't let sport and politics mix, But it was very challenging, and they managed to get the teams overseas. But one of his big ambitions was to host the ISF World Contest in South Africa, and the ISF committee were very keen on that as well, especially after the end of summer came up. They wanted to have a contest at J Bay or Bruce's, and John eventually convinced them Cape Town was the best place for it. probably because he lived there and he didn't have to travel. But
Yes.
there's a lot of variety of breaks. It's the first world city. It's got infrastructure. It would be quite easy to. And we have had numerous, international surfing contests here since. And then just got quite far with it, and then got cancelled, and then 3 times in a row, 68, 70, and 70. No, sorry, 70, 72, and 74. Got quite far down the line, and then political pressure. And by then, by 72, John had become quite tired of, anybody that's involved in surf administration knows that it's a thankless job and very frustrating, and lots of politics and people moaning. And by then, we have this term in South Africa called gatvol, which is basically arseful, which just means you're fed up. And by then, the Hobies that appeared on the scene, he was exposed to Hobie Cats in Australia when he was there for the 1970 ISF World Contest.
Right.
Sailed on a Hobie with in Sydney, and he knew about the Hobies, but he'd never seen one, and he just knew this is going to take off in South Africa. And by 73, he pivoted into the Hobie Cats and basically, quit his role as the chairman of South African Surfing, and stopped making surfboards pretty much, and then moved on to the Hobie Cats. So where he achieved his goals, he got a world champion, he got a contest, a world Hobie 16 world champs, Hobie 14 world champs were held in Plettenberg Bay in 1979. So he achieved a lot of his goals, and then also, in the late 70s, Sean Thompson won the South African. So a few things happened. Sean Thompson won the world title in 77. And then they had the ISA, which replaced the ISF as the amateur body, had a world contest in East London, which was won by a South African called Anthony Brodowitz. So John, his goals for surfing were ultimately achieved, but
but not with his direct involvement.
No, but I mean, all the foundation that he laid in the groundwork that it would never have happened without that,
Well, I also wanted to talk about the change in surf culture. You mentioned early on, after the endless summer, 65, 66, surf culture was kind of exploding in a very positive way in South Africa. But, within a few years, as you describe in the book, the kind of hippies took over and concurrent with the shortboard revolution. So there were a lot of changes going on in surfing and surf culture around the world, but also in South Africa, reflecting those changes. Kind of tell us how that fits in with the story.
Well, I think it was particularly pronounced in South Africa, that dichotomy, or that sort of juxtaposition, because South Africa was such a conservative place. I mean, highly, the Calvinist Afrikaners that ran the country. I mean, we've got a word for them, verkrampt. Just absolutely so conservative, not even funny.
Sorry, you got a word for them? What is it?
Yeah, it's called verkrampt. Dutch word meaning like just tightened in a knot. It's just they're just so
all balled up.
Yeah, and that whole free living hippie culture was complete antithesis of this Calvinistic straight edge
tight sphincter.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, and heavy censorship, and just this whole. The two did not align at all, and surfing got the stigma in South Africa of being, and obviously smoking pot was a no-no, and surfers got this reputation, and it was very much influenced by the travelers that came to the Eastern Cape and St. Francis and J Bay to surf. They introduced LSD. That's where LSD was introduced to South Africa, was in Jeffreys Bay. It's a story that people don't know, that there was some American surfers that brought LSD inside their surfboards to Jeffreys Bay and started selling it and to fund their travels, like they did everywhere else. And surfers really got the stigma of being, good for nothing. That stigma pervaded right into my life as a surfer. I started surfing in 1979. By the mid 80s, long-haired rock and roll punk, just outcasts, that whole culture was really looked down upon for decades in South Africa, probably more than anywhere else because of this real conservative, approach to life that society had.
Right.
So it was really pronounced here, and really hard to be a surfer in South Africa back in the day, but we made it through.
Well, that's for sure. Now, all this time, or most of this time, when John was starting out as a surfboard manufacturer, he was also a combi salesman. He worked at the local Volkswagen dealership, which is one reason why there are all of these Volkswagen combis in the movie, The Endless Summer, because the surf community all bought Volkswagens from him, and they would all go surfing in a caravan. So the caravans of Volkswagens that we saw in The Endless Summer was a fairly common occurrence. But tell me a little bit about his role as the primary combi salesman in South Africa, and what that meant to the surf culture.
Well, it's significant in many ways because the Volkswagen, the VW assembly factory was in a city called Port Elizabeth on the Eastern Cape, just past Jeffreys Bay. And he used to go there quite regularly for seminars and to pick up vehicles to drive back to Cape Town. He would fly to it's called Kruger now. They've changed the name of the city, but it's Port Elizabeth. And then he would drive back down the coast, and he would go look for surf. Every time he was on one of those assignments, which was fairly regularly, probably once or twice every 2 months, he would take a left or a right and go down to the coast and look for waves. So a lot of the surf spots that he discovered were because he was doing that, on the East Coast. And then the other thing was the combi.
Around his circuit, basically.
Yeah, and the other thing is the combi. At the time, I mean, you couldn't get a more ideal surf exploration vehicle, high clearance for the dirt roads, and you could sleep in it, and have your camping gear in it, and fishing gear, and your boards in the back, and so that was really foundational part of surfing spreading in South Africa. And then obviously as a salesman, and he was making surfboards at night and selling cars by day, he would sell a surfboard and a car as a deal to the surfers. We called it a two for one.
Perfect.
And then what happened was that the surfers realized, he sold a lot of Beetles as well. The Beetles and the combi, it's got a domed roof, and it's quite hard to tie boards on them. So him and another guy called John Heath came up with this idea to make a surfboard roof rack out of aluminium piping. And so they started making these racks, and the demand became so great that he sell the rack on the vehicle already, they could drive it out the lot, with a surfboard that they called the three for one, board, car, and a rack. And so that, and obviously then the surfers would go off and surf. So there was quite a funny story about his job as a salesman. And then also he learned, the value of branding and marketing, and a lot of that stuff that he took into surfing, he learned during his time as a car salesman. So he took that sort of salesman, marketing, promotional ethos from the motor vehicle industry into surfing as to market surfing and the surfboard.
Right.
So
we talked a little bit about the international surfing and how John got South Africa into the international surfing contests. But the relationships between South African surfers and Hawaiian surfers, for instance, was pretty close, and as well as California surfers. So can you kind of describe the early relationship between South African surfers as they were introduced to the international surfing scene, and how the other surfers from other countries treated them and reacted to their presence on the scene?
Yeah, I mean, don't forget the Australians as well. They had a major influence on surfing in South Africa.
Yes.
They introduced the shortboard to South Africa. Gordon Machant, Keith Paul, John Batcheldor, and those guys came to South Africa in the late 60s with their shortboards, their fantastic plastic machines, and really influenced the shaping here and performance. And obviously the South African Springbok surfing teams going to the international events and making friends and being influenced by American, Australian, and Hawaiian surfers, was foundational for South African surfing. Especially the Hawaiians, there's just an affinity there, especially with the Cape Town surfers. Cape Town is raw ocean, big waves. It's hardcore, and all the Cape Town surfers, but also the Durban guys. They were really hungry. It's almost like you could almost say they were like the Brazilians were. In the 90s and 2000s, that sort of emergence of this new country of really hungry. After the sanctions, with the boycotts and the financial constraints put in South Africa, the rand didn't travel very far. The guys were broke, and if they went to Hawaii for 6 weeks, they had to make it count, and they charged like demons. I mean, the guys that really stood out in terms of Mike Lamont, Gavin Rudolph, Johnny Parman, Sean Thompson, Mike Thompson, and some other guys as well. Still spoken. Their performances were still spoken about on the North Shore. And then obviously in California, there was this, California, and they were, so stoked to be there, and they made lots of friends. And South Africans generally are pretty friendly, easygoing people, and kind of fit into the scene. Especially the Cape Town, there was a really strong Cape Town, California link, and then there was a really strong Durban, Australia link, and obviously there was intermingling. But
I'm sorry. I remember when Dick Metz. I'm sorry to interrupt. I remember when Dick Metz was visiting John at home in South Africa. He said, "Well, this is like Laguna Beach," because they were throwing a party for him, and the whole surf community came out and swapping stories and talking shit and drinking and playing music and having a good time.
Yeah, and those connections that were established in the 60s, went through to the 70s and the 80s. People like Paul Nadir, Barry Wallens, James Sampson, who ran Ripcol in America for a long time. South Africans are actually disproportionately influential, particularly in the Southern California surf industry. You go to any surf company, you'll find a South African in a position of influence.
Good.
And all the way up to Paul Nadir, who's obviously a visitor, and is they're all part of that conveyor belt of people that moved over there, and there were connections, and say, okay, well, Barry van der Meulen, there's so many guys that have moved from South Africa, in particular to Southern California, to Laguna and San Clemente, Dana Point area especially,
right, that
have really made quite an impact on the industry in over there. Firewire, what's his name again? Sorry, his name's just wrong. But there's that foundation was through John and his contacts in the surf industry there. That just everything built from there.
Right. Well, speaking of international relations, I wanted to ask about one particular competition. That was the 1970 ISF in Australia.
Yes.
There was a major U.S.-Aussie rivalry at the time, and there were drug busts, underage chicks, thefts, sensational media coverage, and Drew Campion wrote that the 1970 ISF Championships was the death of all contests. Tell us a little bit about what happened there and why that was why Campion wrote that.
Well, I think that was really performance-wise was at the cusp of the shortboard era, and I mean, what is his name again? Rolf Arness won the contest on quite a long board, and there was a lot of disgruntled. So I mean, it was quite a mess, and the ISF, they're battling to run that organization the best of times. And that contest really sort of came to a head, this sort of generational shift between the old school longboard, toes on the nose, drop knee cutback influence, and the new school, with the short boards and the rip and slash and lacerate approach to surfing, going up and down and doing cutbacks and, really, really starting to rip properly. I think that was a major influence. It was a generational shift in terms of the old school guys, you know, they probably didn't mind having a few beers or whiskeys, but and probably smoked a lot of cigarettes, but that was it, you know. And then this whole new crew of guys that were smoking marijuana and popping LSD and doing all sorts of wild things, and long hair, lyric, you know, bright colored clothes, and you know, that generational shift. And at the same time, you know, this momentum towards this concept of professional surfing was also starting to build, and really was weakening the foundations of the ISF considerably. I mean, they had one last spurt when they had the contest in San Diego in '72, and then that was ISF was done.
Yeah.
So that was really, I think, what Drew was quite helpful. I had a nice long Skype conversation with Drew Campion when I was researching the book, just to get context around all of that, you know. And
right.
he was very helpful. I must give a shout out to Drew Campion and Matt Warshaw, both of whom really helped me with my research, gave me things of contest reports and, you know, articles in magazines, and allowed me to just get that international context, because my whole thing was to elevate John as an icon of not just South African surfing, but world surfing. You know, his influence, you know, right back from the first contest that he attended in 1966 in San Diego, Eduardo Arena, the head of the ISF, really took to John, and they became really good friends. And John's approach to how contests should be structured and how things should work, they adopted a lot of the things that he recommended into the ISF. So he was really, you know, he had a massive influence on so many levels, on not just South African surfing, but global surfing. And I think that was something that I didn't know when I started researching the book. And I think people don't know that this guy, he's not just a South African surfing icon, but he's a global surfing icon on the level of Hobie Alter and Bruce Brown and Grady Clark, and you name all those guys, you know.
Right.
Exactly, he's one of them. He should have a star on the surfing Walk of Fame. I know there's a few Walk of Fames, but he should have a star on one of them.
Yes.
Because he really is that influential, you know, and his impact on global surfing is really unknown. And that was one of the things I wanted to do, was, you know, write about that and you know, make that known.
Well, I think you did a stellar job of that, and the context that you put it in, as we mentioned before, it's really impossible to separate John's story from the story of South African water sports in general.
No.
Now, the first South African surfer to win an overseas event was Gavin Rudolph at the 1971 Smirnoff Pro-Am at Sunset Beach in Hawaii. So now we're making a transition into, you know, professional sporting events with
Gavin actually won. He won the first
prizes and so forth.
And Gavin actually won the first Gunston 500 as well. It was called the Durban 500 in 1969. He actually won that too. Yeah, you know, I actually know Gavin pretty well. I surfed with him. I haven't surfed with him recently, but I used to surf with him quite a lot. I mean, he's in his mid-60s now, and he's still charging like 10-foot waves. He's an amazing athlete. Really, you know, it's the other sad thing about South Africa, something that South African surfers talk about a lot. Like, if we had the talent that we had, which is disproportionate to the population, you know, that of these talented surfers that we've had all the way from that era all the way till now, the challenges that we had in terms of distance and money, and sort of being outsiders. And Gavin was probably one of the first of those guys. And then never quite lived up to the, but his great contribution was winning that contest, because it showed the other guys that it could be done.
Right. Now in back to the 1970 ISF competition in Australia, Mike and Sean Thompson beat Wayne Lynch and Nat Young in the heats, but they lost in the finals. And Ralph Arness, Midget Fairley, and Droon won the top 3 spots. Yep. But Mike and Sean really made a great showing for South African surfing at that contest.
Yeah, that was that whole contest. You know, even though it was, you know, sort of marred by issues on the beach and in the water, really was a turning point for South African surfing. First time that South African won opening round heat, Sean Thompson, and first time that the two of them, and you know, they were actually both originally supposed to be in the semi-finals. And you know, actually, there's a guy called Andrew McKinnon who's an old Aussie surfer from that era, and Sean Thompson and Peter Townend actually, and myself had this back and forth just before I finished the book on this whole question of what happened there, you know.
Right.
Yeah, because it was all triggered by a blog that I wrote, and Sean Thompson wrote it, and he said, "No, I wasn't in seventh. I wasn't ninth. I came seventh." And I was like, "Are you sure?" And then I sent him these results that I had, you know, from a newspaper article. He said, "No." So what happened was that they had a quarterfinal, and then Sean and Mike actually got through to the semi. But my suspicion is that some people complained, and so they had a what they called a sub quarterfinal. They had another quarterfinal. They had another 2 quarterfinals so it was almost like they built up the points over these 3 heats for the guys to make the semis and to make the final. Sorry, and Sean and Mike didn't make the cut. And so it's a little bit controversial, but you know they both went on to acquit themselves as Sean obviously is world champion, and Mike I think he started gotcha and finished 5th in the world and was, you know, pipeline backside tube riding pioneer, him and Sean. So they really made their impact, and all those guys, you know, sort of came up under John as their manager.
Right.
So yeah, it's a great story, but yeah.
You know, and also, and you mentioned before at the 1970 competition, this is where John was introduced to the Hobie catamaran.
Yeah.
There was a dealer in I think it was Sydney. I might have the wrong
Yeah,
city.
no, Sydney. There's a guy called Danny Keogh.
Denny Keogh in Sydney. He was an Aussie board maker, but he was also the Hobie Cat dealer, and so John onto one. John took to it immediately and ordered 4 more to be delivered to him in South Africa, and that one those 5 Hobie Cats, 14-foot Hobie Cats, were the basis of yet another major phase in John's career, when he segued from organizing surf competitions, to organizing Hobie Cat competitions in South Africa, and then eventually got involved in the international circuit as well. If you can give us a short version of how that developed.
Well, so John started assembling Hobie Cats. He got the first one, which was his boat. It's called Numero Uno. And actually here, just down the road, literally 100 meters away from where I live, is where he first sailed it.
How about that?
In this little place called Hobie. And I actually have a story about that, because I grew up on the beach here. My house was one block back from the beach, and one of the abiding memories of my youth was the rattling of the Hobie cables on the mast. And I only realized when I was doing the book, and it used to keep me awake at night, because it was a Hobie Cat regatta sort of, you know, place that they used to race in the garden. So I got John to thank for my lack of sleep as a teenager, which I only realized much later. But yeah, and then he quickly realized that, you know, the demand, you know, it wasn't great in the beginning, but, you know, he had the space in his factory because he closed down his surfboard factory. He was still making blanks at the time. John made blanks right up until the 80s. But he had this extra space in his factory, and they started assembling the Hobie Cats. They get all the parts in, the pontoons, and you know, all of them, they put it together.
Right.
And then he started making the mold, because the Hobie, the core of the Hobie is clock foam. You know, inside it's just like it's the same process as making a surfboard. So
yeah,
you know,
fiberglass hull and Clark foam.
Yeah. So they started manufacturing them, and then while they were manufacturing them, same with the surfing. In order to promote the sport, let's get a competitive side going. Let's have regattas. Yeah, it was quite slow in the beginning, but eventually it took off like massively in South Africa, to the point where the 2 South Africans won the 1978 Hobie 16 world title in Texas. And it was actually the first South African yachtsman that had ever won a world title in any yachting discipline. And
Padre Island, right?
Pardon?
There was the San Padre Island.
That's right. Yeah,
right?
yeah. And that was it was a really big deal because just like America, you know, and other places in the world where the Hobies was considered to be an upstart, you know, and the yachting, the snooty cap and tie wearing yachting establishment really pushed back against Hobies because they saw them as threats. You know, the monohull racing guys saw the Hobie as, because it was getting so popular. And you know, back in the day, a lot of the guys that raced Hobies were surfers, the ex-surfers, so they knew the ocean. And then they got all the yachting guys to come in that were sailing monohulls, and a lot of them jumped over to Hobie, and it really boomed in South Africa. I mean, if you couldn't go to any beach anywhere that was conducive to sailing a Hobie Cat, and it just be I mean, the place I grew up, if you look in the bay, just hundreds of them out there. It was ridiculous. It really got to a point where there was, you know, John factory from 73 probably to about the early 80s is making anywhere between 600 to 800 boats a year.
And he was doing this in his repurposed surfboard manufacturing facility, which was all rigged and so forth.
By then, he'd actually bought the adjacent, there was sort of these semi-detached old Victorian houses, in fact.
Right.
Started his original surf factory, and he bought the one on the one side and he bought the one on the other side, and then he had 4 of them in a row, and they had this production line that knocked a hole in the wall and they put the pontoons to dry it in the next building. And it's a funny story about that because the building inspector came around the one day while John was up the coast and saw this ramshackle operation these guys had and forced them to get another premises further down in the city. And that was really good timing because that was just when it was exploding and actually needed space. And they were making hundreds of boats a year. It was just amazing. And then the great stat is that from that win in 78, more South Africans have topped the podium in Hobie Cat regattas, world regattas, than any other nation. First, second, or third. I mean, South Africans absolutely dominated that sport through the 70s. There was a bit of a wobble during the mid-80s with apartheid, like it really became difficult for South Africans to attend international regattas. But as soon as Nelson Mandela was freed from prison in 1990, and he really pushed the sport thing, that, you know, that sports must integrate and, you know, that whole stigma needs to be dropped. And in fact, one of the first international competitions held in South Africa was a Hobie Cat regatta. After Mandela was freed in 1991, they had the Hobie 16 Worlds in Langaba,
right?
Which Hobie himself attended. And there's a great story about that one of the guys, which I didn't put in the book, but because I couldn't corroborate it. Only one person told me the story that when the Americans were flying back, Nelson Mandela was on one of the planes with some of the Hobie Cats. And they started talking to him, and he was like, "No, please come back to my country. We need you to come back. We need," which is quite an amazing story, you know. The Hobies really made a massive impact in South Africa, and it was absolutely booming industry, and you know, probably thousands and thousands. In fact, the interesting thing about Hobie Cats is that they were the most popular in Johannesburg, which is landlocked, 650 kilometers from the sea, but they've got a lot of dams. And it absolutely boomed up there.
Lakes and rivers too.
Yeah. And Hobie visited the factory in '91 and said that actually no, he was here before that. He was here for the 79 Worlds. That's when he came. And he said that John's boats were the best quality boats, and you still see them sailing. If I go down to the beach now and I see 10 Hobie Cats, probably 2 or 3 of them were Whitmore Hobie Cats that were manufactured in the 70s and 80s. They're still sailing. Because they're so well made. It's a really incredible manufacturer.
Now, one of the other South African surfers that you profile in your book is Ahmed Collier.
Yes.
It's a South African surfer of color, and he was fighting to be on the team, but was not able to do that. And kind of tell us about the San Diego incident with John when Ahmed was trying to join the team for a competition, but was essentially turned away, and what happened after that?
Yeah, well, he was making a statement. He was an activist, anti-apartheid activist, which, you know, in that time was a real risky thing to be. You know, it's in 1972, and he basically was just trying to make a political statement. And we traveled to San Diego to try and enter the contest. But what happened, obviously, people know the surf history, know that the 72 San Diego contest was delayed because the sponsorship fell through, and they delayed it by a week or 10 days or something.
Right.
And that's another one of the contributions that John made. He was quite instrumental in putting that contest on. But Ahmed arrived early, and the contest had been, but at that point, I didn't even know if it was going to happen. And John was quite surprised and quite disappointed in that. He was very much sort of allied with the South African government and their approach, which was to separate the sports. And there was no South African surfing body for people of color. And Ahmed was real. I mean, I actually later in my life, because I know his son Kaz, a big wave surfer, I'm quite friendly with him, and I got to know his dad quite well. I got quite friendly with Ahmed, and absolutely respect that guy for putting his neck out. Where a lot of other people sort of, he stood up and he said, "No, this is not right." And that was the first, big statement that he did. He actually had to plan his trip in secret. If the government, they were so paranoid, they had spies everywhere. If they found out what he was trying to do, they would have arrested him. So he didn't even tell his family. He got on a plane, bought a ticket the day before he left, and got on the plane and flew to San Diego. And unfortunately, I probably wasn't able to make as much of a statement as he probably could have had the contest gone on its schedule, but it was delayed. And he didn't hang around in California. He went to Hawaii. He met up with Eddie Aikau, who had obviously experienced racial discrimination at the Gunston 500 that same year in July 1972. He went on the radio in Hawaii and talked about his experience as a surfer of color in South Africa, and how unfair it was that they couldn't compete in the competitions. But then when he came back, him and a bunch of other guys, including Shani Nagia, who was that guy that I talked about earlier, became when 1994, all the white surfing and sports bodies all were dissolved. And in many cases, there were concurrent surfing bodies, and the South African surfing body for people of color was called the South African Surfing Union. And that was founded by, amongst others, Shani Nagia, Ahmed Collier, and a couple of other guys. And that united with Surfing South Africa to become, with the South African Surf Riders Foundation, Surf Riders Association, to become Surfing South Africa, which is the governing body of the sport to this day. And Shani Nagia, who John encouraged to surf, back in 1970 at a surf breaker in Cape Town, became the first president. So it went full circle. But yeah, Ahmed's contribution to South African surfing is of equal stature to John and Max and all the other guys, but obviously in a very different way. And then obviously he nurtured his son Kaz, and Kaz became South Africa's first big wave surfing champion, and the most successful surfer of color up until Mikey February, really, in South Africa. And actually surfed against Kaz in a competition the other day, so I saw him the other day. So there's big contribution there. And without people like Ahmed, everything changed, and for the better, of course. But we needed people like Ahmed to stand up for the rights of the majority of the people in the country, for sure.
Yes. But now, one of the fun parts of the story is reading how John would be in his element when he was calling a contest or when he was judging a contest. He'd be out there in his, well, you describe him, what it was like to see John in action at a surf competition.
Yeah, I obviously I was very young when John was in his heyday, and I never, I saw him a few times as sort of like the golden god going past in his combi or whatever, when I was a young grom. So I didn't experience it directly, but a lot of the guys told me that, he just had this energy about him. He was just this sort of enigmatic, iconic figure, with his goat beard, his diamond-shaped goat beard.
Cowboy beard.
Yeah, and he would wear a Stetson at the Hobie Cat competitions in the 80s when he was running the Hobie Cat regattas and stuff, and he'd have a clipboard and he'd have a loud hailer, and and then he'd shoot the cap gun to stop the race, and he was just that person that attracted people and really was the lightning rod, without which a lot of things wouldn't have happened, in surfing and bodyboard, and Hobie Catting, and then bodyboarding. So he did the same thing for the Moray Boogie in South Africa, and when he sold the Hobie Cat enterprise and moved on from that. Then he had space in his factory again, and through his relationship with Tom Morey, his friendship with Tom Morey, although they were very different. I mean, Tom was like a real out there kind of hippy dippy type of guy, and John was a real straight and narrow type of conservative chap.
Yeah.
But the two of them really were great friends, John and Tom. And I think John's family has told me many times that he always had to be busy, he had to be doing stuff, but his mind was always racing. That he had ADHD, which was obviously not diagnosed until as a thing until quite recently. And it's just I think him and Tom connected on that level, like they were inventors, and knowing what I know about Tom and obviously knowing what I know about John, I think you can see it, that how those two would be friendly. And anyway, the upshot is that Tom had already sold Moray to Kransco, but he was still involved and recommended that John be the agent for Moray Boogie in South Africa in '78. And in the early 80s into the mid and late 80s, bodyboarding boomed in South Africa, just over. I mean, it was just an explosion. And ultimately, again, South Africa became a dominant force in the sport. There's multiple world champions. Andre Botha in particular won two world titles. Sasha Specker is a friend of mine who won the drop D world title, and a couple of other guys that are really involved in the sport. And again, it all goes back to John. And he founded the competitive structures and promoted the contests and made the bodyboards, manufactured the boards, and really started another industry and another water sport for South Africa. So his influence is just over the decades, just crazy. How much impact he had.
And the legacy, as you said, I mean, there are still Hobie Cats sitting out in the yard or in the bay right by your house.
Yes.
It's just pretty amazing.
And his surfboards as well. I've actually got one in my garage.
Really?
John Whitmore's a personal surfboard that he won the South African Surfing Champs on in Durban in 1966. In my garage. Some guy bought a book camp to collect the book from me and brought the board with him and said, "No, yeah, you can borrow it." So I'm going to take it for a surf. I took it for a paddle the other day. I put wax on it, cleaned it up, put wax on it, but it's flat here at the moment. So I just took it for a paddle in the bay. The paddle floated fine. It's a bit yellow, but it's and there's so many of these boards out there that John made in the 60s, early 60s, mid 60s, that are still, people are still surfing on them. They don't make them like they used to.
Oh, no.
And, it's pretty amazing. Like he was really, his attention to craftsmanship and making a quality product is somebody asked me that in the podcast the other day, what do you think his main contribution is, in particular to the South African surfing industry? And I said that standard of quality, that standard that he set, everybody else has had to follow, and it's become like, it's just embedded in the culture of South African surf industry that we have to make quality products. Max Wetland as well was the same, and you see a lot of Wetlands as well, old Wetland surfboards from the 60s and 70s that are still big surf. So it's just that mentality of making the best product possible and not cutting any corners,
Right. Well, that's why they last.
Yep.
Now, you mentioned the boogie board era, and how Tom and John bonded over boogie boards. Also in his later life, John got into motorcycles, knives, calabashes. And there was an encounter also when Bruce Brown returned to South Africa with a film crew shooting Birth of the Endless Summer, or excuse me, not Birth of the Endless Summer, but the Endless Summer. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about his involvement with that project.
Well, I think the South African segment of that of that movie is a standout.
Yes.
You know, there's Elands Bay and Jeffreys Bay and Bruce's. And Bruce actually phoned John late in 1991 and said to him, "Hey, I'm making a sequel, and we're coming over there in February." And John said, no. Don't come in February. February is the worst time to surf, pretty much in the whole of South Africa. It's onshore, it's flat, and especially the East Coast. He said, no, come at Easter, which at the time was in April. All the people have, you know, they've come after the Easter holidays. Everyone have gone back to work and school. It's been less crowded, and it's a really good time for surf that time of year in South Africa. So Bruce said, okay, fine, we'll delay the trip a little. So, you know, I think if they had come in February of 1992, they probably would have got skunked. But they came in April, and they got firing surf at Elands Bay and up the West Coast, and then they got absolutely firing J Bay, and then they got not a firing Bruce's, but they got a surf with Bruce's, Pat O'Connell and what's his name, Nut. So yeah, they and then obviously John was pretty instrumental in setting that whole trip up for them as well. You know, the South African segment. Yeah, so there was a chance for John and Bruce. Yeah, they kept in touch over the years, but they hadn't seen each other for quite a long time at that stage, and then they got to hang out with each other and drink whiskey and smoke cigarettes and cigars, and you know, pretty cool.
Well, I think one of the cool quotes in the book from John is this: "I've made my pleasure my business, and my business my pleasure." That kind of nutshells what John Whitmore did with his illustrious life.
Absolutely. You know, he followed his heart, he followed his passion, and you know, he was a visionary as well. I mean, you could see ahead. You know, and I'm not just saying this. Like a lot of people that I interviewed that knew him very, very well said this to me. You know, that this guy, you know, he was able to see the future. I mean, one of the things that he foresaw, I had this conversation with someone the other day, was women surfing.
Yes.
He was a massive, massive proponent of women surfing. And we're going back to the early 1960s here. In conservative South Africa, here's this guy, masculine, man's man, and he's like pushing the woman into the water and absolutely enthusiastic about women surfing. And not just because it would double in surfboard market, but because he genuinely believed that women had you know, he believed surfing was for everybody. And he was really, you know, he just absolutely loved surfing so much, and water and the ocean and ocean sports, and particularly women surfing. You know, I feel like he was decades ahead of his time. Like, you know, this was 30, 40 years before Blue Crash, that he could see, you know, that, and I mean, women surfing at the time was completely disregarded. I mean, it was thought of as a joke, but not by John. He really believed that, you know, that was part of the future of the sport. And so that's one way that you can see how he was thinking ahead, you know, and you could see things down the line that, you know, everybody else was just focused on that hand in front of their face. He was looking ahead, and that's why he was so successful.
Well, Miles, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you. I have to say, it's we've covered a lot of territory, but there's so much more to the story. I highly recommend anybody watching this to pick up a copy of The Oim, because it is truly the full story of South African water sports and John Whitmore's life. Now, where could people find out more about you and perhaps be able to purchase a copy of the book?
Okay, so there's a website, johnwhitmorebook.com.
Okay.
Where I'll sell the book online, and I'll sell part of that 495 Rand, which I think is about $25, somewhere around there. Excuse me. That's signed by me, numbered. It comes with a Whitmore sticker, a Whitmore surfboard sticker. And you can purchase it from me, and I can send it to, especially in the lower 48 states. It's quite reasonable for me to courier it to people. There's also an ebook version on Amazon, and I think if you just Google John Whitmore book. Don't be confused. There's a very famous, there's a motorsports pioneer in the UK, also by the name John Whitmore. And then the Shack, the Surf Heritage and Culture Center in Laguna, have got copies. They're moving premises at the moment, so their website's they're not selling stuff.
Yes,
But
I think they're reopening in April.
Yes, when that goes well, I think they're going to start up the e-commerce part of their site in February, and they'll have copies for sale. A friend of mine, George Mayu, who comes from Glenbeach, from Camps Bay, and was in part mentored by the worm. He's got a surf shop in San Clemente called Brew Surf, and he's got some copies there. And I'm trying to convince the guys at the Hobie stores to stock copies, but I think I missed the boat with the holidays. They haven't got back to me. But hopefully they'll stock some as well. I know that one of the stores is quite keen to take on copies. So yeah, there's all those different ways that you can get copies. The easiest way is just to go to johnwhitmorebook.com and order online and get a courier to you.
Very good. Well, thanks again, Miles. It's been a great pleasure. Look forward to seeing you again at some point, either in South Africa or here in California.
Yeah, you must come over and visit us. Yeah.
All the best.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Stephen.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Yeah, cool. That was a great conversation. Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks, mate.
All right.
Be good.